My name is Bruce Cunningham. I'm Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy, and on behalf of the school, I'd like to welcome all of you, and in particular, Tom Keenan and Mrs. Betty Keenan, to the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture. The Sanford Distinguished Lecture was endowed by a gift to Duke from the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust. The purpose of the lecture, which is co-sponsored today by the Hart Leadership Program and the Keenan Institute for Ethics, is to invite a distinguished person in public life to deliver a lecture to the Duke community and also to spend some time with Duke students. The language of the endowment fund notes that Sanford lecturers shall be men and women of the highest personal and professional stature, such as presidents, prime ministers, and cabinet members, chief executive officers of corporations, visionary artists, and esteemed scholars. We view this lecture as our most prestigious because it honors both the founder of the Sanford School and his extraordinary public service, first as a member of the 82nd Airborne during World War II, then as the greatest governor in the history of North Carolina, president of Duke for 15 years, U.S. Senator from North Carolina, and finally as professor of the practice of public policy here at the school that bears his name. Past Sanford lecturers have included Nobel laureates and heads of state, such as Shimon Peres of Israel, Oscar Arias of Costa Rica, Turgut Özal of Turkey, and Yoshihiro Nakasone of Japan. In thinking about this year's lecture, we could think of no one better qualified to discuss the critical topic of leadership, a subject that is of profound concern to the Sanford community, than Nan Keohane. She is not only a distinguished leader, having served with distinction for over 20 years as president of two of the major universities in the United States, Wellesley and Duke, but also a distinguished political philosopher and theorist who has just completed another very thoughtful book, Thinking About Leadership, whose aim, from this dual perspective that combines her knowledge of political theory with the insights she gained as a leader, is to provide a clearer view of what leadership is, in the hope that it might enrich the theoretical while being useful to leaders, would-be leaders, and followers alike. In her trek from graduation as a high school valedictorian and a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Wellesley to being a Marshall Scholar at Oxford and a Sterling Fellow at Yale, where she got her PhD, then professor at Swarthmore, Stanford, where she was awarded the university's highest teaching honor and was chair of the Faculty Senate, the University of Pennsylvania, Wellesley, Duke, and Princeton, where she is now the Lawrence Rockefeller Distinguished Visiting Professor of Public Affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School, are too numerous to mention. I would like instead to list only a few of her accomplishments at Duke, noting that typically in her own modest way, she would be the first to tell you that they were accomplished only with the help of a lot of others. The Women's Initiative, creation of the Freshman East Campus, reorganization of West Campus, creation of the health system, the Baldwin Scholars and Robertson Scholars Program, the Keenan Ethics Program, the University Scholars Program, the $2.36 billion capital campaign, then the fifth highest in the history of American education, the Duke-Durham Neighborhood Partnership, internationalizing the university, and diversifying the faculty and student body. In my mind, what really stands out about Nan's leadership style is her intelligence, the fact that she has strong values. With Nan, people always know where she stands. Her capacity to absorb and synthesize what others have to say, to reflect on it, to make tough decisions, and then to lead in a way that gets people to follow. In discussing the format of this event, and in the spirit of collegiality, another trait that marks Nan's leadership style, we decided as an alternative to a formal lecture to present a conversation with Nan on the topic of what makes a good leader. This more dynamic format might give interested students who never had a chance to meet Nan a chance to get a better sense of one of Duke's great leaders. As a result, we will first engage her in a conversation with two interlocutors. One of our faculty, Kristin Goss, a political scientist who studies American civil society and civic engagement, shares research interests with Nan and advises students in one of the leadership initiatives of the Hart Leadership Program, and one of our students, Mike Lefevre, a senior public policy major, a student in the Hart Leadership Program, and currently president of Duke Student Government. and then we'll open up the conversation to the rest of the Duke community. First, a few housekeeping chores. If you haven't already, please turn your cell phones off. The dialogue will take place here for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q's and A's. And while Nan is on a tight schedule, she agreed to sign copies of her book upstairs after the discussion. With that said, please join me in welcoming back to Duke University our Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecturer for 2011, Nan Keohane.
Great. Well, I'd like to add my welcome on behalf of Mike to all of you. Thank you for being here. So to get started, we wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of talk a little bit about the inspiration behind your book. As you know, there are many books about leadership, and we were interested in what compelled you to write yours and what, through the book, you're hoping to add to the discussion.
That's a great question, and I will answer it. I do want to start by saying that since this is the Sanford Lecture, and I am a great admirer of Terry Sanford, I'm particularly honored to be here for that purpose. I was lucky enough to know Terry Sanford when I came as a new president, and I can only begin to tell you what an amazing mentor he was. I don't use that term lightly. I haven't had many mentors in my life, but I learned an enormous amount from him about leadership, about Duke, about politics. And he was available when I needed him, but he didn't come and tell me what to do when I didn't ask. But I was smart enough to ask pretty often. And I remember only one thing I would share with you today. I remember many things, but the one that I mentioned in my book, and perhaps the most colorful, he once, in one of his conversations with me, which often usually happened over breakfast, he liked having breakfast with people, including students at 7 in the morning, if anyone would join him when he was president. I remember once in the president's house at breakfast, he made an analogy that always stuck with me when he was trying to explain that it was important as a leader not to get bogged down, not to get yourself into a rut so that you just go through the same routine and think, you know, I know all about this, I've been here. He said, a college or university president is like somebody watching a carousel move around, a merry-go-round. You sit there and you say, okay, I've seen that red horse before, or that giraffe just came around between the hippopotamus and the chariot. He said, the trick is to look for the animal that you've not seen before and pay specific attention to that. And don't just assume that you've all been there, you've all done it, but pay particular attention to things that are new and need your innovative and creative thinking. Very good advice, which I often remembered. The other thing to say is, of course, it's great to be here giving the lecture at the Sanford School, and it's marvelous to be able to celebrate that. So why did I write the book? You're right, there's so many books about leadership, and why on earth would I add another one to the pile? Some of them are very thoughtful, and I'm sure they're the ones you read in the Hart Leadership Program. Some of them are sort of airport books that you wouldn't even spend money on if your plane was delayed for 5 hours, but except maybe you might. But I decided to write the book quite early, actually, when I first accepted the invitation to be president of my alma mater in 1980, which was a long time ago. I did so for many reasons, but one of the reasons was curiosity about what it's like to be a leader, what it's like to have power. I'm a political scientist, remember, a political theorist. And I thought at the time, you know, we study power, we study leadership, we talk a lot about leaders, but we look at them from outside. And we think about what it must be like, but we don't know. And we mainly try to figure out how to constrain them and keep them from misbehaving and fouling the rest of us up. But what would it really be like to be a leader? And how does it feel to have power? And a college or university president, of course, doesn't have the kind of power as the head of the US or something, but a good deal of power. And I took the job partly to find it out. And I told myself at that time, someday, when I finish and go back to being a political scientist, I will write a book about how it feels and about what it is like to be a leader from the inside as a theorist, not as a book of memoirs. And that was the purpose of the book. So what is it? It's a sort of a guide through territory by someone who's been there a few times before, which is a little bit better than going for the first time by yourself, but it's intended to be theoretical. It has a lot of anecdotes about leaders I admire. and only a few anecdotes about myself, but it's putting theory and practice together.
Now, there are a lot of students here who came, they respect you, and they look up to you, although many of them haven't actually met you. And I know a lot of them came here today because they're hoping to walk away with a better understanding of what makes a good leader, frankly. And I know that you discussed the number of different types of leadership books out there, but certainly your book has its own take on what makes a good leader. And so I'm wondering, both how would you define good leadership, and also how would you have maybe fostered those leadership qualities in yourself?
I feel like I ought to stand behind the podium and give a speech on that one, but this is a conversation, so I'll give a briefer answer, and then you can probe, because it's a very deep question. What makes a good leader? Quickly, reminding ourselves that there are two senses of the word good that might be relevant here. Good in the sense of effective, competent, gets the job done, and good in the sense of pursues morally praiseworthy values or tries for goals that we regard as worth trying for. So that, for example, there's a lot of debate in the, quote, leadership literature about whether Hitler was a leader or whether in order to be a leader you've got to do something good. I tend to believe that because he commanded folks, led folks, mobilized people's energies, he was a leader, but he was a bad leader in the second sense, a leader who mobilized energies for horrific goals. However, when I think about a good leader, I usually am assuming that we're not going to have many horrific leaders around, luckily, and that the main thing we're interested in is what are the things that make a leader competent or effective? We hope they'll be pursuing worthy goals. And I would say very quickly and rather superficially that there are three different elements. One is traits or skills that you come in with or that you gain. Another one is experience, having some opportunities to test yourself as a leader and mature. And third is luck. Machiavelli talked about fortuna, and he was absolutely right. Whether you get the opportunity at the right time and the right place, that's part of it as well. So traits and skills, there's a chapter on that. And what I basically say in the chapter is that the most important quality that leaders can possess is good judgment, being able to make wise decisions, appoint good people to work with you, know when something is ready for deciding. There's so many things. I go into it in more depth than anything else in the book, what it means to have good judgment. I think that's the first thing that makes a good leader. And judgment is partly a matter of something you're born with or instinct. It's partly intelligence. It's partly sort of a sense of, I mean, like Terry Sanford said, being able to know how to look, what to watch for. And I think even very young children have it. I think about my grandchildren, you know. Two of them, I think, are going to be natural leaders and have very good judgment, even at age 5. A couple of others whom I love dearly, I wouldn't follow anywhere. I sort of wander around, and they'll always be wonderful. They'll be artists or, you know, wonderful, but they're not showing good judgment. So I think judgment is partly innate intelligence and instinct and a sense of a perspective, but it's also a matter of experience. People become better judges by going through more trials or observing more Olympic competitions. So it's partly, that's a sort of traded skill. But in addition to judgment, there's courage, I name, and I'll stop this now because I've been long enough. But I mentioned two pairs of traits here that you might not think of together, and I am very much indebted here to Max Weber. There's an article, an essay, which if you haven't read it yet, I very strongly recommend it as the best single thing I know about leadership. The last 10 pages of an essay, which was a lecture that Max Weber gave at the University of Munich in 1918 called Politics as a Vocation. And in that last 10 pages, in a nutshell, he talks about what you need to have if you're going to succeed as a political leader. And he mentions things that we don't often think of together. Passion and perspective. He says you need to care deeply about something. Otherwise, you're just going to be in it for some selfish, tawdry reason, and you'll be cursed, as he says, by the creature's worthlessness. So you have to care about a cause, but you also have to have some perspective on it. You can't just get so deeply engaged in it that you lose all your sense of proportion. And those two things, as he says, don't often go together. But the other, he says, and it's related, is empathy and detachment. You have to care about the people you're leading. And many manuals of leaders tell us we're supposed to be empathetic, and I believe that's right. But on the other hand, you need some detachment from yourself, from the situation, from the people you're leading. You're going to have to make some tough decisions. And some of the people that you're leading won't benefit from all of them. You're going to have to judge people's performance, and sometimes you're going to have to be critical. Sometimes you might even have to fire somebody. So you can't only be empathetic. And you also have to think about the good of the whole community you're serving, not just the individual good of each person, which empathy alone would lead you to. So those are sets of traits that I think are important. Having some experience is very valuable, and also just plain old luck.
So how did you actually foster those traits in yourself, and was that something that you did consciously? Or did you find yourself one day saying, wow, I can lead?
How many of you sort of said to yourself one day, wow, I can lead, that's neat? Maybe you have, that's good. I was just at a wonderful lunch with the Baldwin Scholars, and a similar question came up. I guess I did sort of the same sorts of leadership things in high school that most people do, although I wasn't president of the student government, but I led a little bit in high school and college. I never intended to be a college president, wasn't an ambition of mine, but I got into it for a variety of reasons, mostly caring about my alma mater and the curiosity that I mentioned, and the loyalty to the cause of a women's college, which it was. Once I got there, with very little training, very little experience, I had a very demanding first few years, because I walked in never having been a department chair or a dean or a provost or anything else. So it was like drinking from a fire hose. And I would have been better off probably if I'd had more training. I would have avoided some beginner's mistakes. But I think at some point in those early years, when I got over some of the challenges and made some decisions that were wise, and people were saying, wow, that makes sense, I suppose that was the time when I said to myself, it's pretty late after all, you know, I was in my 40s, but when I said to myself, hey, you know, I can do this, I can lead. It's a good moment.
You discuss in your book our tendency to think that good leaders should be visionaries, but you point out that many effective leaders like Roosevelt were more likely to move play to play. Right. And we're wondering which style most characterized your leadership, and if you think these two different styles are substitutes or complements. Are they in tension, or are they symbiotic?
I was thinking, and I mentioned in my book, two wonderful quotes from people who were not convinced of the value of a vision for leaders. The first, President Bush, who said, you know, the vision thing, he was really bothered by the vision thing, he didn't like it. And Lou Gerstner, who was a CEO of IBM when I was serving on the board, who basically says at a time when IBM was in real trouble, as you may recall, the last thing IBM needs right now is a vision. We need to get down to work and fix our problems. And I resonate to both of those. And so I guess I would also say, and then I'm going to come back and say I also think I have some visionary elements, but I also believe it is a big mistake to walk into a new institution that you know nothing about with a big vision. I'm going to transform this place. It's a really big mistake, because you don't know enough to know whether that's going to fit and how it's going to be accepted. I guess if you've been at an institution all your life and you're promoted or demoted or whatever to president, then you can say, you know, I have a vision, I've been thinking about this for a long time. But if you come into a new institution, which is often the case, and certainly for me at Duke, I knew a little bit about Duke, but I'd never been a student here. I thought it was very important not to come in with a big vision. I needed to understand this wonderful institution with all its traditions and so many people who care deeply about it. And since one of the first decisions I had to make was the decision whether to make East Campus an all-freshman campus for residential life, a lot of people were saying, that decision has been sitting around, everybody's been waiting, it's time to make it. And I said, I'm not going to make that decision my first month at Duke. I need to know much more about this place. And so it took a year. By the end of the year, I was ready to recommend to the board that we do have the East Campus become an all-freshman campus. And I was having breakfast with Allison Halton this morning. She was reminding me that it wasn't that simple. We jawboned a lot of people. We talked to a lot of people. We worked it all through. But the point is, I didn't come in with a vision. We should create a freshman East Campus. I came in greatly admiring of Duke University and wanting to support and extend its mission. But I didn't come in believing it should be a different place. But during the time we were here, there were quite a number of changes, good changes, programs we introduced, I mean, I look at the Keenans, and I think of the Keenan Ethics Institute. If I had been smart enough to come in with a vision for the Keenan Ethics Institute anywhere, that would have been great. That was Frank Keenan's vision that he worked with me to share. So you develop visions as you become part of an institution. I think you don't just come in with them ready-made and impose them. So that's a complicated answer, as usual. I mean, I'm an academic, I give complicated answers. But I don't think you come in with a ready-made vision, but you certainly shouldn't just sit there and stagnate for 12 years and let everything remain exactly the same. It's an opportunity for creativity. Institutions grow and change, and you want to be part of that as a leader.
Would your answer be different if I had asked you about the presidency of the United States in today's era?
Wow. You got a room full of political scientists and public policy folks here. You ought to ask them. Would it be different? I guess if you're going to run for president of the United States, if you've been a citizen all your life, which by definition you have, I would probably expect that a vision may be more relevant because people want to have some reason to elect you beyond their thinking you have the skills to do this and somehow you're in the right place at the right time or whatever it may be. And they want to have some sense that if you take the job, this is something you're going to do. And that's one reason they want. And then they want you to because they think you're going to be skilled and moral and those things as well. But having a sense that this is the direction in which you're going to move. So if you vote for me, this is where we're going to try to go. Yes, I think it would be more important.
Right, thank you.
We were particularly interested in the references you made to Roosevelt, and so I'll continue with Roosevelt again. You cited the observation that he believed leaders need to be their own director of central intelligence, not relying entirely on their subordinates. But on the other hand, as you point out, university presidents have many claims on their time, and they need to defer to the leadership of their deans and their directors. Doesn't this present a quandary for university presidents? And if so, how can the president ensure that he or she is, in particular, in touch with the student body, for example?
There are too many layers to that question. Let me unpack them one by one, because I think the issue about Roosevelt and how he approached this is interesting. But I also think the question of how any leader in a complicated organization approaches the task of getting and using information is a very important question. But then the question of how you stay in touch with the student body is a twist at the end that I will come back to. In terms of Roosevelt, in the book, I use a number, as I said a moment ago, I use a number of examples of people that I find fascinating as leaders. Most of them are presidents or heads of state, simply because as a political scientist, I tend to know more about them and a trained historian, but also because there's a lot more information out about them in the world. Here I'm following Machiavelli's Prince, not his precepts necessarily at all, but his format. In The Prince, Machiavelli, as those of you who've read it will remember, uses some examples and threads them throughout the book. Cesare Borgia, Louis XII. Now these all are people we require footnotes for, but his readers wouldn't have. They knew who Cesare Borgia was. And I do the same with Franklin Roosevelt, with Margaret Thatcher, with Nelson Mandela, 6 leaders that I mention most often in the book, plus some others like Eleanor Roosevelt or Jane Addams that I mention occasionally. So Roosevelt is one of the 6. And one of the reasons I chose him is because he's such a complicated leader. I admire very much what he did in many ways. But the more I learned about him, the more I realized he was a very mixed person as a leader. It was very hard to work for because he liked pitting teams of people against each other to solve a problem. And they wouldn't even know about existence of the other team. And all of a sudden, they would find out that, you know, he was going to accept some other solution. They'd been working for 3 months with every ounce of energy they had. And here's this other team doing the same thing. It's a weird way of leading. I wouldn't have done it that way, but I found it interesting. How does it have to do with information? He believed in the same way. You get lots of different sources, and you learn from all of them, but you also read papers yourself. You read directly. You don't take things in pre-digested form. Then the real kicker is what you said when you said, but how do you have time? Because you can't just sit down and read, in the old days, 6 newspapers this morning, you know, follow every blog every morning. So there you have to have people whom you trust, who will give you information and whom you know will tell you what you need to know, not just what they think you want to hear, or what they want you to hear for their own purposes, but what you need to know. And you have to have lieutenants, colleagues around you whom you can trust to do that, a relatively small number of them. And I was fortunate enough to have that. So you don't have to get it all directly. On the other hand, and this gets to your point, it is equally important to spend some time yourself going around, seeing how people are working things out directly, not just getting information secondhand. I remember when I first came to Duke and was going around getting to know all the different offices and schools, I visited the dean of the law school. And I wanted to go to her office. I did this with all the deans. And I visited people in their cubbies. I visited them in their workshops, print shops, wherever. And I wanted to see where they worked. And people were amazed, what's she doing here, I wanted to see where people actually do their work, including the dean. And the dean said, I think it's the first time a Duke president has visited the dean of the law school in her office in living memory. And to me, that just seemed so odd. So I like getting out, kicking the tires when people are planting something or digging a hole on the ground. I'm known to stop and say, why are you doing that? What are we doing here? Not critically, but just I'm curious. Why are we doing this? Okay, so student body.
How about the students?
How about the students? I want to give you the background because that's basically half of my answer for the students. I want to know how the students are looking at the world. I want to know what they see as working right and what is problematical for them. But with all the groups that I've talked about, and maybe particularly with students, I don't want to generalize. It's not as though every member of the student body has the same view. Now, sometimes people may largely agree, but every student has a distinct experience. So one way to, quote, stay in touch with the student body is to talk with folks in your job or a similar job, with the officers whom the students have elected, or the young trustees or whatever. And that is very important, and I think it's very much worth the time. But another is to just go out and talk to just ordinary, random students, to go and have lunch or, have office hours and get people to come in and talk to you. And that, I think, is equally important. So it's a double-edged situation. You want to talk to the folks who are elected and representative because they're there for a reason, but you also want to just get a sense of testing the waters with other people as well. See what they're doing. Go out and watch. Mm-hmm. Go to sports events. Wind up sort of sitting in the back of a class, whatever. I guess I didn't do that. I wouldn't do that. Sorry. Might have been nice, but wouldn't have been fair. But that's the sort of thing. Does that answer your question?
That answers it.
Long-winded.
And I appreciate that that we shouldn't be, the buck doesn't really stop with student government. Getting to the students themselves, we consider to be pretty important. So I appreciate that answer.
I think your constituents are lucky that you think that. That's good.
Okay, so in your book you have a chapter on gender, and I wanted to turn your attention there. You talk about studies suggesting that on average, women in some cases lead differently from men. And I'm wondering, in today's day and age, can women publicly discuss or exemplify these gender differences without validating stereotypes about nurturing, selfless women that have traditionally kept women from assuming positions of power?
Where do I start? You've summarized part of the chapter very well, but I would back up for just a minute for the people who haven't had a chance to read it. I guess one of the points that I'm making in the chapter that I would want to emphasize here is, and it's one thread in what you'd say, but I would stress it at the outset. I don't think all women lead differently. It's as odd to say that as it would be to say that all men lead the same way and then all women lead another way, and it's different. One example that I often give, and I just gave it at the Baldwin lunch. So Jimmy Carter and Genghis Khan, all men leading the same? I don't think so. Margaret Thatcher and Mother Teresa? I don't think so. So all women don't lead the same, and all women don't lead differently from men. Women are individuals. Each of us has our own leadership style. And I don't think all women are more nurturing. Margaret Thatcher was about as unnurturing as you could be, and deliberately so. She was proud of it. Okay, so on the other hand, and this is what you're getting at that I want to answer quite seriously, I do think gender makes a difference. And I believe it makes a difference for several reasons. First of all, because we are socialized differently as boys and as girls in any culture. In some culture, the socialization is very different. I mean, boys and girls are raised totally separately for totally different lives. In our society, it's not that different, and some kids are raised in gender-neutral homes where, you know, the boys get dolls and the girls get trucks and so forth. But even so, most of us are in a culture where we are raised in a slightly different way if we're boys and if we're girls. If our parents don't do that, the culture does. Why is that relevant? Because that affects how you live your life then as a grown-up. The way you've been socialized from the time you're 6 months until the time you become a grown-up. And I think that it matters then the gender in which you've been socialized, how you're going to approach anything, leadership as well as anything else. But as Sandra Day O'Connor once said when she was addressing this same issue, you're also socialized by other things. You're socialized in your profession. You're socialized in your culture and your region and the things you care about. And so gender is one way in which you're socialized, but it's not the only one. The other way in which your question is relevant and important is that there are expectations too. People expect you to lead differently because you're a woman. And that creates a challenge in itself, because if you do, then people say, see, I told you so, women are nurturing. If you don't, people say, you know, where is she getting off? Why is she being so aggressive? Whatever. So my experience has been that most successful women leaders, either consciously or unconsciously, reach a kind of a mixed style in which they have some elements of masculinity and some elements of stereotypical femininity. But one of the main points that I make in my chapter is that the stereotypes themselves are unfortunate. And it would be better if we could get to the point where each individual could lead in ways that were most comfortable for him or for her without anybody saying, oh, that's typically feminine, or oh, that's not feminine enough. So can women talk about it? Yes, I think we should talk about it. But I don't think we should talk about it in a way that's either defensive or exclusionary. Women need to say, look, there are some ways in which it's challenged to be a woman leader because of these expectations. There are also ways in which it's a magnificent opportunity because of the ways in which you can provide a role model for young women coming up after you, or maybe focus on some changes that need to be made that you would have understood more as a woman, whereas daycare or whatever else. So I think, again, a long-winded answer, but I do think it's something that we should talk about, but in ways that are productive and optimistic and open to the future.
Thank you.
I don't want to have you jumping around too much, but a few minutes ago you said something interesting. You raised Weber's three key ingredients to great leadership, and you define them as passion, a feeling of responsibility, and a sense of proportion.
Actually, you're quoting him explicitly. I didn't say that, but you're right. That's what he said.
I'm quoting
Bravo.
your book.
Good job you're doing here, right? Passion, a feeling of responsibility, and a sense of proportion.
That's right. Now,
That's
I don't want to get too political, but using that rubric, could you perhaps evaluate the leadership of several recent U.S. presidents for us?
You don't want to get too political, but I mean, I'll say something about the leadership of U.S. presidents recently, because even though it's easier for me as a historian to talk about people in the past, yes, although I don't want to just limit what I would say to U.S. presidents, so let me take a running start at your question by talking about one leader that I admire enormously, who's not an American president, who's Nelson Mandela. And the way in which he combined, I mean, when you think about his life as a prisoner for all those years, and the fact that he came out without bitterness, and he even used those years in prison to strengthen his qualities as a leader and change the minds of the people around him, and came out ready to take leadership in his country, and did negotiations that he took the initiative in to make it free. I mean, there's so many ways in which I admire Nelson Mandela. More than almost any other leader that is familiar to all of us, he's the first one, I would say, who was a good leader in so many senses of the word. In terms of recent American presidents, I have a good deal of admiration for Barack Obama. I think he's doing a very good job in many ways. I'm a Democrat. I voted for him, and I have certainly admired his wrestling with challenges that would make any of us sort of gulp. I mean, dealing with the financial crisis, dealing with 2 wars, dealing with all the kinds of things that are on his desk, it just makes you sort of step back and say, how can anybody wake up in the morning and realize all those things are on your table. I think he's done a good job of addressing the issues. I don't agree with everything he's done in all of them. I might have done some of things differently, but he at least seems to have tried to explain why he's done it, instead of just assuming that we'll all think it must be okay because the president did it. And I also think he has, at several points, used moments like the Tucson shooting or the opportunity to talk about race to bring the national conversation into a focus that we all are better for. One of the things I talk about in the book that is very valuable for leaders is good rhetoric. And he is, at his best, very good at pulling us together to concentrate on things that bring us together as a nation. Now, as I say, I don't agree with everything he's done. There's some ways in which I might have acted differently. But I have a good deal of admiration for the way he's doing that job. In terms of other U.S. presidents, Bill Clinton and I went to the same high school. I didn't know him, but I had a crush on his cousin. It's that kind of family, right? And I know Hillary Rodham Clinton from Wellesley. She was a member of the board briefly while I was president. So I know the Clintons at least a little bit. It's a little harder for me to detach myself. But I think Bill Clinton was someone who had enormous skill, capacity, potential, and enormous empathy with people. I remember once, and then I'll give a judgment about him. I've not forgotten your question, I'm sorry. But I once was at Dartmouth with Bill Clinton. We were both receiving honorary degrees. It was a day like today. This was June in New Hampshire, and it was like this. It was raining and cold, and we were under a little tent thing, a canopy thing. But the audience was just out there under their umbrellas. Many of the people had fled back to their motel rooms to watch it on TV, including my husband, who was watching on TV. But he was able, therefore, to tell me something very important that you could only see on TV. After Bill Clinton gave his speech, which was actually quite a good speech, and he came in before and he greeted the faculty and the staff at the pre-commencement breakfast, and he was, right there, and he spoke well. And then after he spoke, Dartmouth still believes it's a college, not a university, and so it still has the tradition of all the students coming forward to shake the president's hand. It takes a long time at Dartmouth College. And Bill Clinton got up and shook all their hands, every student who was graduating. And what Bob said from the TV screen was, if you looked at his face, every time he shook a student's hand, it was like that student was the son of his best friend. Every time. And I've been in his, not been in his presence that often, but often enough to know that that's the way he is. He's an incredibly charming, extremely smart person. You're not a Rhodes Scholar for nothing. And yet, he did not live up to his potential. He sort of shot himself in the foot in some ways. He got meandering around in a number of ways. He did things that I think he will get credit for in the long run that maybe we're not so well aware of now. But it's a big missed opportunity. For example, on the issue of race. Having grown up where he did in Hot Springs, Arkansas, he's always called the man from Hope because that's where he was born. But he grew up in Hot Springs, which is an unusual part of Arkansas. And he could have done so much with race in this country. I worked with John Hope Franklin on the race commission that Clinton established. And John Hope is such a magnificent leader, was such a magnificent leader himself. And if Clinton had given more support to that, been more invested in it, said this is a high national priority, had some of the fervor that he does when he gives sermons in black churches, he might have moved this country on race. Obama is doing it, but it's harder in his situation, particularly with everything else on his plate. So, two presidents, I've spoken long enough, but I think Clinton could have been an incredibly successful president and was in some ways, but in other ways, he wasted his gifts.
We've been talking about leaders, obviously, and so we wanted to turn your attention to followers. So leaders need followers, and sometimes followers don't follow, as you point out, and this has obvious implications for leadership.
Yes.
So some would say that perhaps since the Vietnam era even, we've seen declining deference to authority in this country, and this includes plunging confidence in government. We're wondering if leaders, including our presidents, can actually lead in this environment, and if your book has any lessons for political leaders such as President Obama for dealing with declining deference.
Well, that's a tough one, partly because when I do have a chapter on followers, and I do have a chapter on democracy. But in those two chapters, I deal with rather different issues of that problem. So I'll come to your question. But in my chapter on followers, I'm mainly interested in the people who are closest to the leader and pointing out that you have different connections with them than you do with the sort of masses of millions who may be your followers. And I also, as you say, get into the question of what happens with non-followers, or people who say, I don't like the way you're leading us, and I'm not going to go that way, and I'm going to join an opposition party, or whatever. In terms of deference, though, that's the kind of statement that I'm not sure I know how to assess. And here's maybe where my historical training comes in. I don't know how we would be able to prove that Americans are somehow less deferential today. You'd have to say today than when? Maybe in the 1950s. But when you think back to the 19th century, some of the kinds of political battles there were then, I'm sure a lot of people didn't think that was very deferential. So I don't know how to say Americans are, quote, less deferential to authority. You'd have to say then whom, then when, who are we talking about? And I guess, I know you're asking me questions, but what sort of evidence would you be relying on?
Well, I think there's, there's declining faith in government. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, frankly, among people who have been teachers for long periods of time, feeling that students have become less deferential. There are, I think, just general, Putnam goes through sort of declining trust, interpersonal trust, fraying social bonds.
Okay.
More megaphones for individuals to have a platform that perhaps could undercut, the unity of, for good or for ill, the unity of the messages coming from leadership.
That's right. You write about the bloggers, for example.
Yeah.
And how they become leaders now.
Yes. Well, I think the bloggers are relevant here. So a two-part answer to your question, and then this is not an expertise of mine. I'm not going to give as long-winded an answer at all. I think the bloggers are relevant because I believe this is a culture that is much more focused in many cases on individual pursuits, goals, satisfactions, ways of getting information, and that's both good and bad. Mm-hmm. Certainly quoting Putnam on the way in which folks are retreating into their little enclaves or isolated places is true. But I don't know that that necessarily means that they're less deferential to authority. It's certainly true that many people seem quite skeptical about government, even negative about government. But usually what they're saying is, they want government to do some things, but they don't want government to do other things. And they trust some people, but not everybody. But you're right. More people are more likely now to say, they used to say, I don't think people in Congress are basically doing a good idea, but my congressman, right. You're right. They're less likely to say that now. So I think you probably have a point, but it's not a point that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and a lot of people in this room have. So That's it.
Thank you.
And now, because we are in the School of Public Policy, I want to try to prompt you to give some policy solutions for us. So what barriers do you think remain to inculcating the skills, confidence, and opportunities to lead, particularly among groups who've traditionally been underrepresented in positions of influence?
I think I get your question, but would you ask it once more?
Sure.
What barriers remain to training these people?
That's right.
Okay. I guess I would answer it, I would take it as a slightly different question, a positive question. How can such people be trained? And then I'll try to go to what barriers remain. Because one of the things that I talk about in my book is a number of organizations that take training underprivileged people as their major goal. The IAF, what does it stand for? Industrial Areas Foundation is one example. They are training their followers to be leaders is one of the main things they do. And they have a very specific way of doing that, of identifying People who are likely to be leaders, just ordinary, run-of-the-street people who happen to come to a meeting and make a good point or whatever it is. And they then have a whole bunch of things they're supposed to do, to go to a training session, to go to a training session in a larger regional section, to have some very specific opportunities to lead. I mean, they've thought a lot about it, and they do train leaders. And so there are some pretty good recipes for how to do it. I guess the question of the barriers then is, why aren't more people learning these lessons? Why are not more organizations specifically giving attention to training folks in the trenches to be leaders? And it may partly be because people who are leaders often don't like giving up power. So they may not want to train too many people to come up after them, because that would mean there'd be some people knocking on the door saying, isn't it my turn? As they're doing in Egypt now, although perhaps not quite so violently. So it may be that it's partly, and I do talk about this in the book, that people who are in power often like being there and don't like giving it up, and may therefore not think that training the folks to come up after them is their highest priority. Or they may just have a lot of other things on their minds. Other barriers, to use the way you asked the question, have to be lack of interest in wanting to be a leader. Going back to the way you were discussing it. I mean, most people have a lot of other things on their mind. Making sure I have a job, making sure my family has, doesn't have some terrible medical crisis, or my car works, or whatever it might be. I mean, lots of people in many situations are not particularly anxious to be leaders. It's not what they care about. And you've got to want to be a leader, and then you've got to have somebody who's going to tell you, you can do this. We need you. And here's how you go about doing it. And both parts are important. And maybe both parts are a little bit truncated in our society right now.
So then how do we go about creating broader opportunities for the rest of the population? It's a school of policy here, so we actively are looking for ways to train students. And how can we better educate them, but also how can we create opportunities for people who maybe wouldn't make it to a school whose mission is to train leaders?
Well, since I also teach at a school of public policy, the Woodrow Wilson School, there are several stages to your answer. One is the very fact that you're here studying public policy and thinking about the questions you are now meditating about is a very key part of the answer to your question, because you're going to go out afterward, whatever it is you do with your life, I hope, either as a political leader full-time or as a citizen who's deeply engaged, and think about policy, try to mobilize other people to join you, and think about the kinds of issues you've now just put on the table. I hope you won't forget about them. I hope you will think, even if you wind up being a high-powered investment banker. It's important for me to spend some time remembering what I said that day in the Sanford School, helping other people come along. And you can do it in a variety of walks of life. But having people for whom that's your mission, and making that a commitment throughout your life, not just now, having people who do that is a wonderful service that this school does and that other schools of public policy do. I'm now sitting on the program review committee for the undergraduate program in public policy at Princeton. And we're asking that same question. So how do we best use our situation as a school of public policy to answer the kinds of questions that you're asking? But the other thing that we do, and that we do at Princeton and that we do at Duke, is bring people from lots of different backgrounds. Go out and recruit students from different backgrounds to come to a place like Duke or Princeton. Provide a lot of financial aid. Recruit in some of the slum areas of San Antonio where the IAF does its work. And it's not necessarily easy from students from backgrounds that are less privileged than many Duke students to come and make that transition. But it's very important for us to make it possible for them to do so. So they directly get the same kinds of benefits that you're enjoying. But I think in the end, it has to be a commitment that people who have the tremendous privilege that you and I and others have, not to forget other people are coming along. And we need to be there preparing the ground, encouraging them, and making it easier for them.
Thank you. I think that's a terrific note to end our structured part of this. And I think now we'd like to open it up to audience questions. So, Bruce.
Right. We have mics downstairs here and upstairs there. And if you'll line up, we'll go back and forth seriatim. And we'd ask that your questions be relatively brief. so that if you have something really cogent to say, try to conflate it, and then we can have Nan answer.
I'll do the same.
Upstairs first.
I am right behind a pole here, so hello.
Oh, hi.
My name's Ryan Brown. I'm a senior and a history major. I really liked what you said about gender and leadership, and specifically using thoughts about gender and leadership in a productive and optimistic way. And so going off that, I wanted to ask you, coming from leading an all-women's college, what specific lessons did you bring to Duke that were useful for a co-ed environment, and how did your experience being president of Wellesley color your presidency at Duke?
That's a great question, and stay there so I can see you. First of all, a slightly different part of this situation, but it's relevant to my answer to your question. Because I had been president at Wellesley, and at Wellesley there are only women presidents, it never occurred to me that I couldn't be a president, whereas some women who've been in situations where there are almost no women presidents, or they're the first woman president they've ever seen, are going to have a harder psychological burden that I never had. I knew you could be president of a college or university because I'd done it, and 12 other incredible women before me had done it at Wellesley College, whose pictures are around the main reading room. So that self-confidence was enormously important. So when I came to Wellesley, from Wellesley to Duke, it never occurred to me that I couldn't be a president. And for some women it might, if they'd never seen a woman president. But the second thing, which is the direct way you asked the question, how is it relevant that I came from a women's college to be president of Duke? First of all, I believe that I brought with me, from the beginning, although it didn't really bear fruit publicly until the end with the Women's Initiative, was a very strong commitment to women at Duke, in terms of women in all parts of Duke who might have particular opportunities or challenges to their lives as Dukies, whether it was undergraduates or emeritus trustees. We started to think about doing something specifically about that my second year at Duke, but we didn't have a lot of information. I was also I was worried that, people will think if she turns immediately to women's issues, well, see, there you go. She's only worried about women. So I was probably a little diffident about it at the beginning. But I did bring positively from Wellesley a conviction that if you're going to be co-ed, you're going to have to do it in a way that serves both men and women well. And you can't just sort of add women and stir. And I thought Duke had done a particularly good job because of the Women's College, which was an amazing and important feature of Duke's history. And I'm now, and I promise not to talk so long, and I will get back to your question, but I'm now chairing a committee at Princeton, the Steering Committee on Undergraduate Women's Leadership for President Tillman. And since Princeton never had a women's college and didn't admit undergraduate women until 1969, it's had a harder time, I think, being truly committed to the education of women than Duke did, because we had always done it. So when I came to Duke, I didn't feel that it was an environment that was in any sense alien to women. I immediately understood that the proud graduates of the Women's College were very much like Wellesley women, and that the women who followed them as women today had some of that feistiness and commitment. But I also found out, of course, that a big university is rather different. The fact that it was a co-ed place was much less important. I taught at Stanford. I had 3 sons. Then the fact that there were 9 schools, and the deans were used to having a lot of power, doing things with money and autonomy, that was not true at Wellesley. Everybody was part of the same college. Varsity athletics on a Division I international level was new, although we had good people who helped me figure that out, and I became an ardent Duke fan very quickly. But the medical center was the newest thing. I'd never done anything. And medical people feel, as any of you all in the room who are doctors know, that nobody can truly understand what a doctor does except a doctor. And so having the medical center as one of the major parts of Duke was also new. But I found that the skills I had learned as well as Wellesley's president did me in good stead as I found my way around this new place. And the fact that I had been self-confident as a woman president and believed in the importance of women was probably important on all counts.
Before we go to the next question, could I just ask that you try to move that mic so that whoever's asked
Here?
the next question
Okay.
doesn't have to lean around the pole?
So I just want to say thank you very much, and there are a lot of women, undergraduate women at this university who look to you as an example of great leadership. So thank you.
Thank you.
The next questioner, could I ask you to also identify yourselves?
Sure. My name is Chris Edelman, and I'm a senior Program 2 major in decision science here at Duke. And my question relates specifically to leadership at Duke. So recently, a lot of unfortunate events have generated national attention and certainly put burdens on the leadership at Duke, both in terms of the administration and the student body. So what I'm interested to hear is if you think there are any specific types of leadership or traits in a leader that are specifically helpful at a time like this in Duke's history, given your experience at Duke, and sort of how that applies both to the administration and to students as leaders at Duke.
Well, first of all, even though I'm still a deep-dyed Dukey in many ways, I haven't been following the details of some of the things that you're talking about with any depth that would allow me to say anything appropriately informed in this room about the specific problems that Duke is facing.
Sure.
I do love this place, but I don't get back often enough. I don't read the Chronicle every day, and I can't tell you, okay, this is what has happened and this is what we need. I can answer at a slightly more general level, but I hope relevant still to your question. Having faced a number of really tough experiences at both Duke and Wellesley, I believe that when a university president or a student government president faces a situation where the college or the university is really in crisis, where a lot of people are very unhappy, where a number of people are suggesting conflicting solutions to a problem, then there are several things that you need to do. I hate to generalize about this because so much of it depends on the situation and the leaders and the time of history or whatever. But I think it's very important to try to be open to a number of different perspectives and say, all right, I really need to understand why some people care so much about this on several different sides of this question. But then I also need to be able to provide guidance and leadership based on my own experience, my own knowledge and background, to say, look, here are some points we all need to keep in mind. Here are some principles that we need to respect as members of this community, which have to do with things like integrity and civility and remembering that our basic goal in the end is the community of learning and knowing and enriching one another. And somehow we got to keep that in mind. Now, it may sound awfully abstract, but if you say that and then you also say, and by the way, here are some of the challenges we're facing. And for me, that would have included the students at Wellesley who were protesting about our failure to divest fully from South Africa and having to arrest the Wellesley students who were protesting for the first time in Wellesley's history. I mean, what did I think about when I was doing that? A lot of it was trying to keep the main principles we were all trying to serve in mind. Or at Duke, some of the conflicts around sweatshops and how we dealt with that. And there I found that it was really important to get to know the leaders of the sweatshop movement and not regard them as just sort of students who were trying to burn the place down, because they weren't. And although it wasn't fun to have them occupying our offices, it wasn't fun to have people shouting in your ear with a bullhorn, I did find that if I went and talked to them and said, look, I want to understand what you're saying, and I also want to tell you what some of the problems are with what you're recommending, that it helped to talk, to listen, and to get information. And here again, I started with Terry Sanford. I'd end my answer here with Terry Sanford. There's a legend, I don't know if it's true, there's a legend that shortly after Terry Sanford came in, he succeeded Douglas Knight, who was a wonderful president in many ways, but had a very difficult time relating to students, particularly when they were protesting. I've heard from people when I lived in the Knight house who came and spent the night on the carpet of his house protesting. So he did had a hard time with students. Terry Sanford was very different. And when he became president, at the end of the first week or so, the students, because, this was protesting the Vietnam War, protesting all the things you protested in the 70s. The students were saying, and he said, okay, they said, we're going to take over the administration building. He said, can I come with you? I've been trying to take it over for the last 2 weeks. So, you may think that maybe some of the students thought, oh my Lord. But some of them were pretty interested. They hadn't heard a president talk like that. So I think it depends on the person and the situation, and I don't give advice to folks who are in very different situations. But I think President Broadhead is doing a lot of good things in this situation, which is tough, and I'm sure that his student government colleagues are as well. But I don't know enough about the details to start giving advice to any of you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Jesse Huddleston. I just graduated from Duke in May and was fortunate to begin serving as an intern in the Duke-Durham Neighborhood Partnership, and I still work there now as an alum. So thank you for starting that office. It's a pleasure to
I'm
be
so
able to
glad
work
you
there.
said that. It's one of the things I'm pleased about.
But I wanted to ask, particularly, you spoke a little bit about race and made reference to university that we were talking about before, how in one instance it was difficult to think about gender because women hadn't been at the university for the entire time. And then similarly, I know at Duke, black students weren't at Duke forever, only been here for almost 50 years. And as we approach that anniversary, I'm just curious to hear what your take is on how you were able to move the university forward with regards to race, thinking about, some of the ideas you thought, trustworthiness, learning, diversity. How were you able to really implement those, and where do you see the university moving forward as we approach the 50-year anniversary of black students at Duke?
I had not really remembered that it was the 50th. That's good. I'm glad you reminded me of that. Well, I think in that sense, first of all, the neighborhood partnership, which is, I believe, one of the most important things that happened during my Duke years. And as you heard from in this gracious introduction, I would say it certainly wasn't just me. John Burness, a number of other people worked hard on it, as you know. But it was certainly something that I care about. And compared to other institutions where I've been, I think Duke is fortunate in the proximity and the visibility and the historic strength and depth of the African American presence here in this city. Because African Americans are so much a part of the government and the history and the life and the traditions of this city that it gives an opportunity for any discussion of race not to be this sort of abstract, exotic discussion as it might be with the best will in the world at a little college in New England, but part of our history and our life. And I believe that that is something that we should celebrate in Durham and at Duke, and that the partnership between the city and the university in many ways is one of the strongest assets that we have. Now, that doesn't always translate into dealing easily with racial tensions on campus. And I remember one of the challenges that I faced when I was here, and it certainly wasn't I alone, but when there was a black person, quote, hung in effigy on West Campus by the black student bench, quote unquote. I mean, that was a terrible moment. And dealing with things like that, when race is thrust into prominence as a topic of conversation by some very unpleasant or angry or bitter issue, is really difficult. It's one thing to talk about the wonders of the Duke-Durham partnership, which we do, but there will also, because our culture is still threaded through with racist beliefs and prejudices that can crop up and hit you unexpectedly, there will still be unpleasant moments, but I am confident that Duke is better placed to master them, to deal with them, and to move past them than any other university I know. So I'm glad that that anniversary is coming up. I wish you and your student colleagues of all backgrounds the best in celebrating it and making this place even better.
Thank you.
My name is Bill Young. I was a graduate of Duke in 1972. You touched on it a bit obliquely, but I'd be interested in what techniques a president today can use to unify a deeply divided nation.
Well, I guess appeals to national history and pride. Supposedly, you know, Americans don't share a whole lot, and we share perhaps less and less these days. But we do tend to share a pride in being citizens of this country. and somehow finding the words to evoke that citizenship and make it relevant in times of difficulty would be at least the place that I would start. However different we are, however different our goals for this place may be, however different our backgrounds, we are proud to be Americans. And that is a word that has a lot of resonance in the rest of the world, sometimes for positive purposes, sometimes negatively. But being an American is not something that somebody would just say, oh, what? I've never heard of that. It's a very important and powerful concept. And I think if I were the President of the United States, I would try to say, we want to find ways in which that resonance unites us across our divisions. And in some ways, I think that's what recent presidents have done. And it doesn't always work. But that, if you could make that really go deep, I think that would work. I think if you could also find ways to make people feel the general impact of things that may seem to be happening to somebody else. So that, for example, if folks are unemployed or folks don't have health insurance, then somehow making other people who are more fortunate understand that that resonates for them. Either it may negatively because the situation may fester. I don't think we're going to wind up like Egypt anytime soon, but I'm enough a historian to know, even for the U.S., that when there are periods when a lot of people are unemployed or deprived, the country rocks, and there are challenges to our daily lives, even if you're wealthy, even if you're in a gated community. So somehow finding ways to make people feel some mutual responsibilities without asking them for enormous sacrifices, without asking them to give all their money or all their time, but just something that makes them aware that we're all part of the same country. Those sound awfully banal, but I think that's really got to be the only way you can do it.
Is there anybody up there? No? Down here?
Hi, my name's Risa Issard. I'm a junior Program 2 major in social change, culture, gender, and sport. And as an undergraduate woman at Duke who proudly identifies as a feminist, I'm really thrilled to be here today to hear you speak. As a previous questioner said, you've definitely been a role model for so many Duke women. We talk about the Women's Initiative all the time. I'm wondering, you talked about how a lot of people in our country and in our communities don't want to be leaders because it takes a lot of effort and energy, and people are focused on their individual needs, whether that's providing for a family or their car or their job or any number of other interests. And I'm wondering, how, as a leader, have you been able to balance certainly those things that are still very important for any person while also being a leader and a role model and spearheading so many wonderful initiatives?
Another really good question. Let me answer it in two parts. First of all, we've been talking today, both my talk and most of the questions, although not all of them, about big picture leaders. So what would you do if you were president of the U.S. or president of the university? And those are indeed very omnivorous jobs, and it's very hard to balance those with doing almost anything else. I will come back to that. But I don't want us to forget, and one of the main points of the book is to say that there are leaders in all kinds of situations. And one of the things that I wrestle with at the beginning of the book is, so why do we use this same term to describe a CEO of a corporation, a head of a government agency, and a warlord in Afghanistan, the head of a Cub Scout troop, the head of a garden club? We say they're all leaders. I mean, how can this be? What do they have in common? And you can read the book to see how I answer that. But my point now, that's a blurb, my point now is to say leaders don't all have high-powered omnivorous jobs. Many of us are leaders in our communities, in our small groups, in much more low-key ways. And it doesn't take all that much time and training and energy. It just means stepping forward when there's a problem, making a suggested solution, figuring out how to mobilize people's energies to pursue that solution. That's leadership. That's the core of it. You don't have to do it on a huge scale to be a leader. And that doesn't interfere with the rest of your life. Now, the kinds of leaders you're asking about is really more not just a question about leadership, but high-powered professional accomplishment, too, which is a kind of leadership, but not exactly what I'm talking about here. Any kind of high-powered professional accomplishment or leadership at a level you've been describing is going to be competitive with other things in your life. And if you're going to take on such a task, you're going to have to recognize that you just don't jump all of a sudden into the ocean. First of all, you sort of work up to it, and you can't do it all by yourself. For me, it was very important to have a very egalitarian, very supportive husband who is a very distinguished political scientist in his own right, but who from the very beginning believed our success needed to be joint. That made an enormous difference. So having the right partner is an important part of it. You can't easily do it all by yourself. Having a partner, having opportunities to work together in the same place, not having to commute. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which it's easier. But the main bottom line, without trying to tell you all the things people either do or do not find to make this work, and I'd be glad to have a conversation with you or others more about it, I think you have to recognize that there will be trade-offs. And you have to decide what your most important priorities are. As a president at Wellesley with kids still at home, the family and my job were the highest priorities. And everything else had to go far away. I didn't have much time for friends, even though friends are very important to me. I didn't have much time for reading or thinking, which is kind of a problem because you ought to be reading and thinking. I didn't have much time for travel, for leisure, which I always enjoy. So you can't suddenly just continue to live your life as if you didn't have this huge 800-pound gorilla in the middle of it. But the 800-pound gorilla is not going to satisfy your needs for personal intimacy and support and love and playfulness. And one thing I don't understand is how anybody could have a job like this without having anybody in their life that they can go home to and just say, you know, what a horrible day, or what am I going to do about this? It could be a partner, it could be a husband or wife, it could be a good friend, it could be a grown child. I mean, somebody that you trust who isn't then going to immediately go and tell the newspapers, do you know what she just said? So you got to have somebody or buddies that you trust in your life. I don't see how anybody who is all alone could ever do a job like this. I think that would be, pardon the phrase, hell. I really do. So I would like to say that having that kind of partnership or a family may make it more complicated, but it's also your salvation.
Thank you.
We're going to have time, I think, for 3 more questions. Nan's going to be able to go upstairs for a book signing. I know from the nature of the questions that many of you have questions that can only be answered by her book. And so this will give you an opportunity to talk to her about it. So we'll start up there.
Hi, Nan. I'm pleased to have been a senior member of your administration. And I watched...
Hello, Myrna.
Hi, dear. I saw firsthand a number of the changes that you made in this institution and in this city. And I'm wondering, as you were doing things, were you thinking also about how to make them endure beyond your term? Were you trying to make them permanent changes? Did you see beyond, knowing that your tenure would never last forever, what were you thinking about in terms of how to ensure that they would not go away when you left us?
Now, Myrna, how many times did I sit around the senior officers' table and say, we're doing this because it will endure? I didn't think about that explicitly very often. I did think this is an institution which has a long history and will have a long history before it. And this is an important moment in its development. And what we're doing is going to be foundational for things that come after us, as things that Terry Sanford did, as things that Keith Brodie did. I mean, you build foundations for other people to work on. But as I say in the book, and as I sometimes think I even thought at the time, although I don't know how much time I had to think thoughts like this, but I wasn't trying to create a structure that would never change. I know that change will happen. I innovated enough to know that, you know, I wasn't just preserving everything that everybody before me had done. And I knew that people after me wouldn't keep what I was founding unchanged. I guess I believed, and still believe, that if you have in the elements of the things you're founding, things that are very resonant with the major values of the institution of which you are a part, they will last. They may be altered in some ways, they may be built on in ways that makes it harder to see exactly what they are, but they will last. But what you're doing is not trying to create a legacy that never changes. Because if you try that, you're bound to fail. And so it never occurred to me that that was what I was doing. But I also did sometimes think of this as being part of a history of building and growing foundations for the future. But I knew the future would be different, and I didn't know how.
Thank you.
I think this will have to be the last question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for sharing your time with us. I'm Jenny, and I'm a junior and an English major. You've spent a lot more time in academia than I have, and I'm wondering what your experience as a leader and an educator gives you to share with us or share with me about the future of particularly universities, as far as what I see as the increasing divide between the humanities and the sciences. It's something that has really interested me in my time here at Duke. It seems that as we go forward, each field is increasingly special, becoming more and more specialized in every area. So how do we strive for excellence in every field and yet still bring those into harmony with one another? And particularly for undergraduates, what does the future of education look like as far as turning out rounded students and yet equipped students?
Okay, that's a really great question to end on. First of all, although you've put it, I think, rightly in terms of divides between the humanities and the sciences, as you know, that's a problem that's been with us for some time. CP Snow, et cetera, has talked about that. But that doesn't mean it's not a huge problem. I would just pick up on another way you described it, the increasing disparities and sense of isolation of every discipline. It's not as though it's just the humanities over here and the sciences over here. One way of doing anthropology looks at another way of doing anthropology and saying, what an alien and foolish thing to do. So the divisions are very strong and growing. However, I think you're right that the future of the university is parlous if we don't combat that in some ways. At some level, it's inevitable. We know so much more, we, members of universities. And that's a good thing. We're able to find out things about the world that our ancestors could never have dreamed. But I spent much of my time as a political theorist studying French thought before the Revolution. And I remember, you know, the guys and gals, they were both men and women in the 18th century and before, who were truly Renaissance people. I mean, somebody like Diderot knew a lot about enormous numbers of things. And that was possible then because he didn't have nearly as much to know as you would have to know today if you set out to write the encyclopedia. So you're at one level luckier because there's a lot more things you can know, but at another level you can never hope to know them all. Therefore, interdisciplinary activity in the deepest sense of the word, not of everybody trying to sort of stumble all over each other, but having a liberal arts general education base that gives you a sense of how scientists think, even if you're never going to be a scientist, how engineers think, how historians think, English majors think, so that after you leave Duke, you'll be able to look back at that and have some sense of what they're talking about, instead of just saying, what on earth is that all about? I think a general liberal arts education culminating in a truly disciplinary major is a well-proven way to approach the world, and one thing we should be extremely grateful for. But we also need to have people talking to each other, both on campus and off. And that's one reason why I think the number of you who've talked about, you know, program 2 majors or whatever, there are a lot of people who are trying to bring this together. Whether you do that or whether you become deeply engaged in a discipline, as I did, I think the bottom line is you need to have conversations, real conversations about ideas, here on campus and wherever you live for the rest of your life. Don't be satisfied with conversations that are only about, you know, what are you going to wear, where are you going to go for the weekend, I'm so tired, etc. Some of those will happen, that's fine, of course. But make sure that occasionally you have real conversations with friends and people that you run into about ideas as well. Find out what they're learning, how they look at the world. Take advantage of the fact that so many people around you are engaged in those other disciplines. And do a little bit of secondhand learning so that you get that partly in addition to your deep dedication to your own profession. That to me is one of the best things about universities. And we'd be a much poorer place without it. And I hope most of you in your workplaces after Duke find that you can do it as well. So, thank you.